Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that wants this whole leadership election to be over too. And how are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm pretty good. Rushed back a bit from work today because I've been a bit busy, but yeah, back from Australia. I think I've mostly survived the jet lag. Sorry there wasn't an episode last week, but it just became too hard with well, I'd have had to be up at 5 a.m. I think you'd have been on at 8 p.m, but then I hear you were quite busy as well. So yeah, we just skipped the week, and here we are. So on to our main story tonight, the Conservative leadership contest. We had 10 candidates last time we talked. Now it's down to 1, I think is what...
2.
Well, you see, I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure there if you were making a prediction about the result. Because I feel like...
I predict there will be a result, and there will be 1 in the end, but...
Yes. Well, so... Fair enough, yes. I suppose what I was trying to say is I feel like if you'd asked us maybe a week and a bit ago, it looked very likely that it would be Boris. And I still feel Boris probably has the strongest position. But we've had a few stories that we're going to touch on throughout this piece where where maybe that's not so sure as we thought it was when we just got down to 2. So how have we got here, Rob?
Yeah, so a very quick catch-up. So... we had our first round of voting on June the 13th with our 10 lovely candidates, who I've already forgotten half of the names of, but I will try and fill you in as we go through here. So the other important thing to notice is that before this vote went ahead, there were so many candidates that the Conservative Party changed the rules. So if you didn't get 5% of the vote in the first round of voting, or 10% of the votes in the second round of voting, then you would be automatically eliminated. So this allowed for multiple eliminations. Just imagine like one of those nights on the X Factor or the Bake Off where suddenly they decide that 2 people are going to go. It's that sort of drama. So on June the 13th, we lose 3 candidates quite quickly. We lose Andrea Leadsom, who, as we sort of predicted, wasn't her time. Her time had passed, and she went without much fanfare. Harper and McVeigh as well. They all failed to reach the threshold of 5%. And then the day after, Hancock pulled out as well. Everybody sort of realising that the writing was on the wall for the campaign. Those 4 weren't going to go any further. So now we're down to 6. Next comes the big sort of media event, which was the Channel 4 debate. And all the story before this was the fact that Boris Johnson had refused to attend and wasn't going to do it. So we had 5 of them left, which was Dominic Raab, the ex-Brexit secretary, Jeremy Hunt, the foreign secretary, Michael Gove, who's Michael Gove, Sajid Javid, the home secretary, and Rory Stewart, all taking part in a debate, talking over each other, hosted by Christian Guru Murphy. Here we go. So there was a press cutting. Sorry, so I will read this verbatim, but it was a press cutting that apparently somebody submitted to The Guardian for their sort of TV preview of the debate that was happening on the 16th of June. He didn't expect it to be approved, but it was, and I'm really glad that it was. So here goes. The UK is bound for hell in a hand-assisted vehicle, there is little doubt. All that remains is to discover which one of these escapees from Pandora's box will taxi us there. A more wretched collection of dissemblers, idiots, narcissists, and people who have mistakenly taken drugs is difficult to imagine all under one studio roof. But here we are. An asbestos-clad Christian Guru Murphy meets the contenders before an audience drawn from across this broken aisle. God actually help us. Which I thought was a nice little preview to the debate that happened on Channel 4.
So I was just going to say one thing I find quite interesting about this debate is that we've discussed before how Theresa May kind of fell into her position, and it definitely didn't feel very democratic. Do you think this was an intentional move to try and make this feel more democratic, even though we don't actually really get a say?
I think so, yes. I mean, Theresa May, I don't know if there would have been debates between the final 2 last time. It all seemed very rushed last time. I remember that, the candidates were knocked out one by one, and Leadsom pulled out very quickly once she made her anti-children mark against Theresa May. So we never really had that opportunity. this seems like an attempt to have a bit more of a forward-facing, like a public-led thing, but at the end of the day, it is just the Conservative Party members that will decide the outcome of this, outcome of this election. And I think particularly when we'll look at polling, particularly with the BBC debate that happened later on. The polls, even though they suggested that the general public liked one person ahead of the other, that didn't necessarily seem to sway Conservative candidates at all. So I feel that this is a bit of a sideshow, and the fact that Boris didn't turn up and it didn't harm him at all seemed to suggest that none of the other candidates were strong enough to really compete with him. Like the empty chair won in that scenario. The only sort of things that came out of that Channel 4 debate was Dominic Raab, notably looking like he wanted to thump Rory Stewart every 30 seconds. Michael Gove sort of going off about, having a weird defense about drugs, sort of saying, I'm sorry I did it, but, just because I've done it doesn't mean we shouldn't come down hard on drug offenders that do it now. So that was a bit weird.
Kind of a mixed message, really.
Yes, precisely. And there was also Rory Stewart's bin analogy about Brexit, which was sort of saying he was accusing the other four candidates of putting their head in the sand and saying that Brexit's going to go on regardless. Rory Stewart said it was like when you've got that third rubbish sack that you want to put in the bin and you're trying to push it down and it won't fit, but here I am saying to my wife, believe in the bin, believe in Britain, which was a very Rory Stewart thing to say, but also, made him stand out. It was a stupid analogy, but he was the only one there supporting the more sort of Remain side, or not even that, even though he wants to do Brexit, he's sort of saying that a no deal isn't a possibility. So that was the Channel 4 debate. That was the outcome of that. We move on to the second ballot very quickly, where you need at least 10% of the vote. Dominic Raab was eliminated, and the BBC went, and then after that the BBC debate went ahead. This was less memorable than the Channel 4 one. There were no sort of like gaffes or big revelations, but maybe the big thing that came out of that was we had two separate polls that came afterwards. One seemed to suggest that Rory Stewart had won the debate. The other said Boris Johnson. So with that in mind, you'd expect that we were sort of heading for a Stewart-Boris showdown, which, in my mind, at that stage, seemed to make sense, at least ideologically. They both represent very different wings of the party. If you want a pure ideological battle for the soul of the Conservative Party, that's the one you want to have. The only thing holding Rory Stewart back was the MPs that he needed to progress in the competition, which is kind of a big thing.
Kind of the key thing, really. As I said, like that's why I thought it was an interesting question about these kind of debates, because it doesn't matter how they poll with the public too much. I mean, it might influence an MP's decision, but fundamentally it's the backroom dealings and stuff we don't get to see that decide here, right?
Yeah, precisely. In those debates, before you get down to the final two, actually all those who those debates are for are the Conservative Party MPs, who have very likely made up their mind. And maybe the challenge for those taking part in those debates is not to say something so atrocious that you have to immediately resign from the contest, which none of them did, or at least none of them appear to have done. Anyway, those Conservatives MPs seem to be very set in their ways, and there's a good example of this. When we did the voting, when Stewart lost and then Sajid Javid lost, he went out and we were down to the final three. I think on two occasions there, Team Boris had the number of votes that they thought they would have placed in an envelope before. Like, they wrote it down on a piece of paper, put it in an envelope and said, right, we'll open that up once the vote is done. And the BBC's Laura Koonsberg reported on this. Apparently, on two separate occasions, they did that, took out the piece of paper with a number in the end, and they were spot on to the MP. So that shows that the Team Boris had really done their research, really canvassed the MPs, knew who they could be guaranteed support from, and that went really well. It also might be slightly worrying for Team Boris that their team is so entrenched in that way. If you're unable to get... It doesn't seem like they were attracting any swing voters at the last minute. People weren't suddenly coming over. They were very set on it, and they were very dead against it. And maybe one of the big things that highlighted this divide in the Conservative Party was that after Stewart went out in the Javid round, there were actually 2 spoilt ballots, which doesn't usually happen within a Conservative leadership party race, particularly when every vote would seem to matter. That seemed to suggest that people thought that, with no Remain candidate or no soft Conservative candidate in the mix, that they felt that side of the party wasn't being represented. So they clearly felt quite angry about that. So now we've lost Stewart and Javid. We're down to our final 3, Gove, Hunt, Boris. So how much do you know about what Gove did to Boris back in 2015?
Well, I think probably the summary is Gove and Boris were both big Leave campaigners, and then they were trying to both kind of go for the idea being, they by being involved in Brexit, it would raise their profile. We kind of think the idea was that they would put themselves forwards as big Leave campaigners. Leave would narrowly lose, and then they'd be like, oh, well, we tried, and they get those votes from those people who would have voted for Brexit. However, as we know, we did vote to leave in the referendum, so then they have to pick a new Prime Minister because Cameron goes, peace, and leaves. We're all expecting Boris to run with Gove as his right-hand man, and then Gove goes and announces his leadership bid ahead of Boris and kind of takes the win from under his toes. Or was it at the same time? I can't remember the exact timing of that. But basically, then they both kind of collapse and neither of them get anywhere in that leadership contest.
Yeah, but pretty much like Gove deciding to run for leadership undermines Boris's campaign so much that Boris withdraws his application to even run in the race. So that was back in 2015, and then Gove, when he actually is in the race, does incredibly poorly and falls out and doesn't even make the final 2. So yeah, it was Gove's apparent stab in the back of Boris was still fresh in the mind of Johnson, and Gove was kind of the one they feared getting into the final 2. He was more of a recognisable face than Hunt, or at least a bit more of a wild card. He's wily, he's played the game. There's a reason why somebody who looks and sounds like Michael Gove has made it so far, that he has, and that's because of his political nous. And yeah, he was the one that they really, really feared. So to sort of combat that, it was suggested that some of those who were Team Boris would move their votes over to Hunt to try and make sure they had enough numbers so that Hunt would beat Gove, but to make sure Boris was still number 1, which is quite a risky play, but still something you can do, particularly if you're in the lead.
And he was in such a lead, right? So
yes. Yeah, he was well over nearly half the party, I think. He had 100 and something votes to about Hunt's 70 odd. So yeah, he had quite a lead. In the 5th ballot, Boris Johnson had 160 votes, Jeremy Hunt 77, and Michael Gove 75. So it was Johnson had load of votes. He only gained 3 votes from the 4th ballot. But there were some suggestions that those who may have come over from the Savage Javid campaign sort of said that, oh, we would vote Boris, but he's going to win, so make sure you put your vote towards Hunt instead. Or at least this was the suggestion in the papers. Whatever happens, we're left with our final 2, Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt. So, let me just ask you quickly, what do you think of that final 2? Is that the ones that you would have picked off the bat, or is that the ones you would have expected out of that bunch?
Well, I think we were all kind of expecting Boris to get this far, right? So I don't think it's surprising, and especially once the results started to come through and it was obvious how much support he had within the party, even if he pissed off a load of people, I think we had kind of expected, as you mentioned, some people spoiling their ballots. We'd expected a Remainer to get to this point. I feel like, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like Jeremy Hunt's not been so outwardly Leave definitely not as much as Boris, but I wouldn't have pegged him as pure Leave, if you see what I mean. I feel like he might be like Theresa May was the Remainer who was willing to do some to go ahead with Leave. He might be the Leaver who's kind of a bit more Remainy, though maybe my reading of him in that situation is off. But yeah, I think I probably would have expected. I wouldn't have been surprised if Gove got into the final 2. But also I felt like the supporters for him were also similar to the supporters of Boris, which is why they kind of fell apart 2 years ago, 3 years ago. So I feel like I don't know. I'm not sure I expected the two of them to get here, but I'm also not that surprised. It's hard to kind of unpack what my thoughts were. I can't remember if I gave a suggestion in the last episode.
No, it's fine. I always thought Hunt was sort of like a safe pair of hands and that he'd make it far, but I thought another person would emerge, a sort of anti-Boris candidate. That doesn't appear to have happened. The anti-Boris vote seems split. I think when we look at that, the figures for the final three, Boris has got a large majority of the party sewn up, and the rest of them are sort of umming and ahhing should they have Hunt or Gove, who are got quite different approaches. Yeah, Boris has secured 51% of the party's votes, while the rest sort of are scraping together just over 24%. So, yeah, it's a tough thing to handle. Sorry, what am I saying? It's a final two that I think I wouldn't have expected right off the bat, but it's the one we've got to deal with, and now I'm kind of seeing a scary side of Jeremy Hunt. You said that he was more Remainy, and I think I remember he campaigned for Remain during the referendum, and I think he would be, he hasn't been as outwardly no deal as Boris in the run-up, but ever since he's made it into the final two, the rhetoric from Hunt appears to have changed quite a bit, particularly on Brexit. We knew from Boris that his big thing is we've got to leave October 31st. I saw a video recently where Boris's biggest cheerleader, Jacob Rees-Mogg, was repeating this line, which was, we can't kick the can, if we kick the can, we kick the bucket, which essentially means if we kick the can down the road and don't leave October 31st, then the Conservative Party dies. That's the big reason. That's why there's this rush within the Conservative Party to get Brexit over. They feel that once they get it done, the Brexit Party disappears and goes away. They don't have to worry about them anymore, and all those people will come flooding back to the Conservative Party. We mentioned their woes, at the local and the European elections. The Conservative Party are not a popular party within Britain at the moment, so the no deal appears to be their get out of jail free card for the party, maybe not the country, but we'll see. This also brings me on to quite an interesting piece of polling that was done by YouGov. Let me see if I can just bring it up. So there's another reason that people are pursuing no-deal Brexit, particularly within the Conservative Party, and this is the sort of, I would say, scary polling of Conservative members done by YouGov on June the 18th. They were given a choice. They would said, would you rather Brexit took place even if this caused this scenario, or would you rather Brexit didn't take place? So if Brexit meant Scotland leaving the United Kingdom, 63% of Conservatives would still support Brexit. If it caused significant damage to the UK economy, 61% of Conservative members would still support Brexit. If it meant Northern Ireland leaving the Union, 59% of Conservatives would still support Brexit. If it meant the Conservative Party was destroyed, 54% of Conservatives would support Brexit rather than avoid Brexit. The only scenario which Conservative members would not want Brexit to happen in is if it leads to Jeremy Corbyn becoming Prime Minister.
That is quite damning. Wow.
Yeah, it's just this weird sort of... You think of all those things, like the breakup of the union, the economic damage, their own party being destroyed. They are willing to take that risk if it means that Brexit can be completed on October 31st. So if you're wondering why internally or why the Conservatives are shouting that from the rooftops, that's why. So moving on with that fact and looking at the sort of the policies of Boris and Jeremy very quickly. So you've got Boris with his no deal sort of shtick. He's saying, he'll play the tough man. He'll, once we get out of Europe, we'll have 39 billion to spend. That's his sort of shtick. Jeremy Hunt was on the Andrew Marr programme, asked that, would he look people in the eye and say that they'd lost their jobs because of Brexit? And Hunt said it would be difficult, but yes, I'd do it. Jeremy Hunt's also said he would cancel civil services leave over August if a no-deal Brexit was likely. That's probably so they can make preparations for one. He also said once he was leader, he would give them about 3 weeks. He'd give the EU about until September to come up with a deal. Once, if they didn't do anything by then that would be it. We're not going to do. It would definitely be no deal. All of this seems to ignore the fact, particularly from the EU. And I think, let me just see if I brought a headline here. This was the one. Johnson false promises locking Britain into no deal, says Brussels chief. That's from The Guardian. Essentially, Johnson sort of going out there and saying that I can renegotiate this deal, and if not, it's a no deal. The EU are already saying, we've done a deal. The deal that we did with Theresa May is non-negotiable. Your job is to try and sell it to your party. Your job is not to renegotiate. There quite frankly is very limited time to renegotiate. Britain had 2 years once it enacted Article 50 to get on and do something. And you saw how we stalled, and you saw what happened with Theresa May. So we're running this very real risk at the moment of Britain hurtling towards a no deal, and both candidates, taking it in a different way. Boris saying that, he'll slash stamp duty and make the country more sort of like, business friendly. He's also promised to boost the pay of public service workers, which sounds like a very popular policy. Who wouldn't want that? I think, those in public service have had quite a stagnated wage structure ever since the economic crash. But where he's going to get that money from is an entirely different question. Hunt is sort of saying that he's planning a no-deal fund, and that, businesses going bust would be a price worth paying for Brexit. That's another one. So they're giving it that shtick, while on the other side, you've got people like within the Conservative Party, you've got the Scottish leader, Ruth Davidson, saying that the UK could break up under Johnson if he's Prime Minister and if he goes ahead with this no deal. So this is the big that's the big question at the heart of it. That's what's leading us to this moment. We've got a lot of debating ahead of us on this issue, but when it comes to Brexit, I'd say both candidates are very clear that their desire is to leave on October 31st.
Yeah, and I think we've discussed multiple times and at length in other episodes why we don't think it's necessarily a great idea. I mean, what has changed? I suppose maybe that could be a silly season episode over the summer, maybe, or maybe just before we get back, we should discuss what has changed, because I think the answer is not much, which is, I suppose, the problem. Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's a bit depressing picking between those two. We alluded to earlier the fact that Boris was doing very well all throughout the MP voting rounds, and now they're kind of going around, they're doing hustings, they're going around the country, they have to convince the Conservative Party members to vote for one or the other. And why did Boris's campaign not really get off to the best start? There was a big news story, wasn't there, like just after they announced those final two? Yeah,
it was literally the day after, and happened at the worst possible time. You've just been given the final two. It should be full steam ahead on the campaign. Instead, the story that broke in The Guardian was one of potential domestic abuse between Boris Johnson and his girlfriend. They were heard having a big row at their house. I think Johnson's girlfriend was heard shouting, "Get off of me," and that prompted the two neighbours to phone the police. The police were called, they had a discussion, they went away. This brought up sort of like huge questions about Boris Johnson's temperament. Is somebody fit to be leader who does that? There's also a sort of like a big scandal about the way he treats women. We all know Boris has had, quite a few relationships in the past, and even some people suggested that he doesn't even know how many children he has. So, again, he's sort of fitting into that Trump mold of leader, I guess, somebody who has that very sort of like tarnished history, but somehow appears to, be Teflon and it all wipe away. I also wanted to touch on the fact that the story was very quickly turned by some of the right-wing papers into a sort of like a smear campaign against the neighbours, and that made it very clear to me how Boris Johnson has influence within the British media. Like he's been a part of The Telegraph and, was, I think, editor of The Telegraph for a while, or at least contributed very heavily to it for quite some time. And that appears to have spread into other papers as well, the way that he's always got a paper to call on the Boris Johnson view. That, the Telegraph had been pushing Boris for leader, I think even well before there was even a Conservative leadership election. But they were the ones that sort of turned the story on its head, suggesting that the neighbours that called, would have done because they're Remainers, which seemed to suggest that every time you ring the police, you might have to state which way you voted in the referendum before your complaint is taken seriously. Some people also pointed out that they're not men of the people. They're not of the people. They're not common people. They live in a very rich house, which is stunning when you live next door to Boris Johnson. So,
yeah, I mean, I just imagine that everyone who lives next to Boris Johnson is in some kind of tiny terrace house. Of course, that's entirely logical.
Yeah, exactly. So there was this odd campaign against them to sort of say, like, that their claims shouldn't be taken seriously. I think Jacob Rees-Mogg even called them a pair of Corbynista curtain twitchers.
Wow.
Which is, quite the rhetoric to be saying. This did put a bit of a dent in Boris's momentum, and I think the polls reflected, like, immediately afterwards that his support among the British public did go down slightly. But there's been a bit of a PR push since then. There was a bizarre photo that did the rounds the morning after that appeared to be released from Boris Johnson himself, showing him and his girlfriend in a field having a lovely time together. Just brush over the fact that Boris Johnson's hair appears to have grown very quickly from the day that the incident happened and the day after. It's sort of like they just picked a good one from the album and said, no, we are nice together. Look, there it is. That photo was like widely parodies online, and I think it was, it deserved that sort of respect. It's a very bizarre and sad situation around Boris, and again, it shows that that's what you get with Boris Johnson as a leader. If you want to have that, even though he's got this weird sort of again, it's Trumpian in the way that, for some reason, lots of people like him. Some people seem to think that he speaks for them, even though he's a posh boy from Eton. I don't know why, but he has that appeal from, among the general populace that seems to put him ahead of a candidate like Hunt. But at the same time, he has a lot of emotional baggage. He has a lot of political baggage that other people just simply wouldn't be able to get away with. But with Boris, he takes it in his stride. So we'll see what other skeletons come out of the closet as we move further on into the campaign. But Boris is Boris, and we'll have to see how that would play out with him as Prime Minister, if any more would come out as soon as he became leader.
We've mentioned they're still out and about. They're still campaigning. When do we get to know the result?
So the final result will be released on July 23rd. Conservative members will be getting their ballots in about 4 days' time on July the 6th, and then the ballot eventually closes on July the 22nd. So there's still a lot of time for people to change their minds, make other decisions. We've got probably another 2-3 weeks of campaigning now. And that's why when I was looking at the headlines for this episode, it is still dominated by the Conservative leadership race, because this fight to be Prime Minister is going on and on. But I think it's also worth reminding ourselves that they are trying to influence 0.3% of the voting population, like 100,000 people. The Conservative Party membership is quite small. It's definitely smaller than the Labour Party. I think the Lib Dems maybe are catching up ever since ever since they started to get that sort of like Brexit boost, or their like Remain boost, since they became popular again. The Conservative Party is now like an odd bunch of die-hard supporters, and it'll be very interesting to see who they pick by July 23rd.
I was just looking up. I don't think there's up-to-date figures for this year, but Labour has over 500,000 members. SNP has 125,000. Conservatives have 124,000. Liberal Democrats had 99,000, but that's in 2018, and I think the Lib Dems have gained quite a lot of members with all the kind of anti-Brexit stuff in the last year. So since August, I wouldn't be surprised if that's gone up for the Lib Dems, but I think they only run these numbers once a year, so we'll have to find out in September.
Yeah, and that the other point, just very briefly, that is worth pointing out there is that the Conservatives, like all parties, rely on their members to some extent for funding. Labour having a bigger group sort of like ties in with their history. They're the party of the unions. They get their money from the unions and from the membership, and by having 500,000 and those £3 members, I think that Corbyn was able to persuade, people who signed up just to vote for Jeremy Corbyn. That was a big boost to the Labour war chest. The Conservatives' sort of slow leaking of members, their slow decline, has worried the Conservative Party on how they're going to survive longer term. They usually rely on donations from, big donations from, one individual, like business leaders, people like that. But there was a fear that those would dry up if they were unable to get Brexit done. So again, if we're tying it back to why they're pushing for Brexit on October 31st, they fear that they'll lose donors to the Brexit Party or to UKIP or to another one who's willing to take those donations. So, small membership causes lots of different problems for the Conservatives. We'll have to see how that small membership votes come June 23rd.
So we spent most of the episode worrying about what 0.3% of the voting population thinks with respect to who should be the leader of our next country. But what does everyone else think? So on to our quick polls update. Look at me, I can do links. So they've slightly updated our favourite page over at Britain Elects, which of course is in the show notes. Things have changed a bit since we last spoke. Labour and Conservatives are still diving downwards. When was the last one of these? So on the 7th of June, the graph was showing Labour and Conservatives both still dropping, Brexit rocketing up, Lib Dems had kind of plateaued, but still with a vague upward trajectory, Greens having an upward trajectory, and Change UK and UKIP diving even further down, which I don't think is surprising. But let's have a look at the last few polls. So since the 7th of June, we haven't had another massive, big Brexit Party poll, because we had the +6 one on the 6th of June. But since then, it's been Labour +1, Labour +4, Brexit +4, Brexit +3, Brexit +2, Labour +3, Labour +2. So the Conservatives have just kind of fallen off the map there. Does that tell us much more than we knew before? I don't feel like the Conservatives have dropped any more, considering they're kind of basically having a big fight over who should run the Conservative Party.
Yeah, I mean, it shows that people are not yet willing to commit their support to the Conservative Party until they know who the leader is. I would say I'm quite shocked by the longevity of the Brexit Party in these polls. I expected them to peak around the EU time, but after that they might fade away again. But no, it appears people are still willing to put Brexit on there, particularly until October 31st or until the Conservatives sort themselves out to see where they're going to commit that vote. So I think that's the biggest takeaway there. Labour has been, all those Brexit Party polls, by the way, have been YouGov. So they're the ones who had the Lib Dem +2 back in May 29th, and then they've been Brexit all the way. Then we've got Opinium and Survation sort of showing Labour on +2, +3. They're slightly more traditional pollsters. YouGov take a wider sample. I think YouGov was actually one of the most accurate during the 2017 election, so you might say that they're more accurate than the others, but as always with polls, it's best to take the average and balance it out, which is what Britain Elects, and particularly that graph, tends to do so well. I think it's worth just pointing out again that although we're saying that that's a Brexit lead of +2 or Brexit lead of +3, look at the actual numbers across those four parties. You've got, so I'll just have a look at the YouGov one that put Brexit on +2 on the 14th of June. Conservatives 20%, Labour 20%, Lib Dems 21%, Brexit 23%, Greens 9%. Over those four, you could throw like a hat over those and just like, if we're talking about a 2% margin of error in polling, then that means that if there was a general election held tomorrow, any one of those parties could theoretically win, and that if any of those parties were to come into power, with first past the post being what it is, we'd expect Labour or Conservatives to get more seats than than Lib Dems or Brexit. They certainly wouldn't have the support of the majority of the public, you're going to have at least 80% of people feeling that another party could have done a good job. And that's the real problem with our democracy at the moment, or how it's functioning. When you've got, we used to have 2 parties pulling in different directions, we've now got 4. And that makes it a really muddled space for anyone to get their voice across and for anyone to sort of come to a good conclusion and to bring the country together, which is a slogan that's been used by both Conservative leadership candidates, and I've heard it being said about Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson is the right man to bring the country together. I'm not quite sure that's true, in these times where we are clearly quite divided, particularly in English politics. I think with Wales and Scotland, they're more certain and are leaning towards the more sort of like the SNP, particularly in Scotland, have the lead there. But in the UK, in England, it's a real mess. And until we know who the Conservative leader is, I think we're unlikely to see a major change in these polls in the near future.
One thing that I think is quite interesting. So we often, if you've followed this link before, you'll know how it is. At the top, there's a poll, a summary of the polls, like a moving graph, which is an average of the poll, rolling average, and it goes back about a year, 2 years. It covers 2 years, and it's quite interesting to watch at the moment because everyone was in kind of vaguely the same position until about March, where, as we know, the Conservatives started a nosedive, then Labour followed them, and we had the Brexit Party appearing and so on. And you scroll down, you've got all this data. But if you scroll down even further, there's how polls have changed since 1997. And you can just see the mess that started happening. I mean, there's a bit of UKIP. You see the spike for the Lib Dems in around 2010. There's a bit of UKIP coming in and that affecting Labour. But then just the change, just look at how different the graph is now to what it has been for the last 10 years. Everything up to now, while it may have had an effect, kind of does feel like it's following a trend, and you can see, whereas the sudden changes we're seeing now are, it's a system in crisis, because we were supposed to have had Brexit by now. It's not happened. There's all these problems we keep talking about, and it's amazing that the graph is changing that much so quickly when you compare it to stuff in the past. Like probably the only other 2 real big jumps in the last 5 years were Labour just before the last general election and the Lib Dems at 2010. Like everything else is relatively flat and changes kind of on a timescale you'd expect. And this sudden drop for the main parties and sudden increase for these kind of new challenger parties is very interesting. And it's also kind of, as we've said before, interesting that Change UK were just this kind of blip, and then they've gone.
Yeah, it's it's weird how they sort of like flashing out of existence these parties. Like UKIP have gone as well. You see what a force they were from that big graph. They've disappeared to nothing and have been replaced by an entirely new party. So, yeah, quite the scenes in British politics, unprecedented, as you said before, particularly in the past 20 years.
Yeah, it's just kind of a mess, really. So, as I mentioned earlier, silly season is coming up. That means we're going to be doing several. I think last year we got 3 specials out in that time, and we'll hope to do the same again. I know we've got some ideas of our own that we might focus on for 45 minutes to an hour. If you have any topics you'd like to suggest, you can obviously come and suggest them on Discord. You can suggest them to us on Twitter at @UmpilPodcast. You can even message us on Instagram at Umpile Podcast, even though that's mostly for us putting out short clips from the show. You can come and find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. You can find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language, and you can find us on our website, parliamentary.observer. You can also now email us at unparliamentary@tinkertailorsoldiersponge.com. I've got emails rolling out for all the podcasts now, so people can reach out to us if they want to. Any suggestions are welcome. I think I still wanted to touch on stats and kind of scientific studies and things like that, which is kind of a bit of a walk away from politics, but has affected it in the past. We'll try and tie that in. What kind of, have you got any ideas on the horizon, Rob, or are you keeping that stum until we release those episodes?
I'd really like to do one on the basics of ideology. So,
that'd be interesting. Yeah.
Liberalism, conservatism, socialism, just looking at those, and maybe some sort of like deeper political philosophy as well. I can go all the way back to Plato and Socrates and some of the core tenets of those ideals. What what influences our thinking today, and they make for some quite good thought experiments. The questions people had to deal with in the past influence how we think about politics, or might influence your politics nowadays. So yeah, really excited to talk about that.
Awesome. I mean, that sounds interesting to me. So I hope our listeners will be as interested as I am. And the only thing I've got to say is that there's links in the doobly links in the show notes, as always, that we put there. There's a link there to our Discord where you can come and listen to us recording live. And of course, if you can go over to patreon.com/TTSS and become a patron, you get access to our bonus news episode we do, and with our other podcasts, there's now going to be bonus content coming along for those as well. So yeah, come and throw a few dollars our way. That helps support better microphones for our other shows. I'll give a shout out to Mishmash Mayhem, which is quite different podcast from what we're doing here, run by CK and Wade, where they do those, those kind of discussions you had at school where you'd be like, oh, I bet you Superman could beat up Batman. Which seems quite obvious. And then somebody like, oh no, but Batman, he'd have the kryptonite fists. It's kind of like that. They have recurring characters trying to earn their mish, their mash, and their mayhem over 3 episodes, fighting against other characters in random locations decided by the die of death. Which I'm honestly not doing justice to Wade or CK's voices when they talk about the die of death. My particular favourite out of the recent episodes was when they decided to fight on the northbound train from Southampton to Waterloo with, I think, it was like a wizard on some side and, some anime character on the other. So, it's a lot of fun. And thanks to the money we've got coming in, I've been able to lend them some nice microphones now to improve their audio quality. So, it helps every one of the shows at TTSS Productions. So please come along to the Patreon and throw some money our way. And if you like us, if you don't like us, I don't know, throw us money anyway. Does that work?
Yeah, do that. Yeah. Give us money to stop, and we'll consider it. There's been a bit of a catch up. Sorry if I've sounded a bit out of it. Probably still a bit jet lagged. Thank you as always, Rob, for joining us and basically running the show, because I've not been so with it this week. And I think it's goodbye from me, and it's goodbye from him.
Bye.
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 Bye. Bye.
I don't know if that means it's also Gyok too. But anyway, thanks to Craig too, Electric Boogaloo, we can go ahead with our recording. And how are you, Rob?
Yeah, very well, thank you. How are you?
I realise I didn't do the intro. Let's stop. And start again. I just got into chatting. I was like, how are you, Rob? Oh,
yeah.
Very good. Oh, that's great. Oh, you got very close to the microphone and then disappeared there.
Oh, sorry. I'm very well, thank you. How are you? And I knocked the microphone there, so I'll do that a third time with professional podcasters. I'm very well, thank you, Tom. How are you?
Rob is doing a Google search. No, it's just, liven things up.